Thank you very much. Stop my timer. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. And this is what I'm going to be talking about, Mythbusters and icebergs. Mythbusters, for those of you who are not aware, is one of my all-time favorite TV shows, no longer on air, unfortunately. And it featured these two gentlemen, Jamie Hyneman and Adam Savage, essentially testing myths. For example, can a car engine run on Coca-Cola? No, it cannot, by the way. But these are the type of things they did. And what I'm going to be doing today is swapping the engineering for social science and putting a myth about Warhammer and learning under a metaphorical microscope, just to explore it. And the myth I'd like us to look at today is this. Doing Warhammer is a waste of time because you won't learn anything useful from it. Now, this myth, I think, appears in many and subtle ways. So, for example, anytime you're out at a party or meeting new people and people start expressing hobbies or sharing hobbies, things they are learning, someone says they're learning woodwork or doing woodwork, someone's learning a new language. Oh, wow, fascinating. And then you share that you enjoy playing with and painting toy soldiers. You start to see the myth in action. And I guess what I mean by this myth is that having a hobby is fine, like having a hobby or Warhammer is perceived as fine, but within certain limits. You can spend too much time doing it, and therefore it seems wasteful because what are you learning here? What is the value of what you are learning? So this is the myth I would like to unpack and explore and challenge today. So to start doing that, I think we first need to ask, what is learning and what counts as learning? And I love this quote from Danish learning expert Knud Delaris. And he talks about learning as any process that permanently changes you or your life, not caused exclusively by biological development or aging. So what this means is that by biological development, I mean that nobody learns to grow from a baby into a toddler. You just grow. Other than that, pretty much anything counts as learning, which is extraordinarily broad. And that means that learning can happen anytime, anywhere, even unconsciously. And a good example of this is I grew up on a steady diet of action films. And one of the things I unconsciously learned, I wasn't aware I was unconsciously learning it at the time, was that if I was ever to find myself in the middle of a street in a shootout, a really safe place to hide is behind a car door. Because there's so many action films where people or police appear at a scene, open the car door, and start shooting. And it was actually Mythbusters years later where one of their episodes tested this myth and they shot at a car door. Not only did the bullet go through the car door, it went out the other side. So that made me realize I had unconsciously learned something. So what this tells us about learning is that it is inevitable. As human beings, we cannot not learn. You are all experienced in learning. You know you've learned things, but there are many things you are not aware of. So this is where I'd like to dig around. And the reason I find this interesting is that if we ask the question, what is learning useful for? And we ask people, what is learning useful for? If I had to summarize the general perception about what learning is useful for in a single image, I would say this. Learning is useful if it has practical value to develop skills which can help you earn money or get a job. And this is a broad, and this view is quite reductionist and reduces the enormity and wealth of what learning is into this very instrumental value that there is it's a means to an end. And I find this quite problematic. And this is partly why I think Warhammer sometimes it's perceived as an environment or a hobby where you don't learn very much. Instead, I'd like to reframe this and start to think of learning in terms of this beautiful quote by Etienne Wenger, another key thinker in terms of learning, particularly social learning. And what if we assume that learning is as much a part of our human nature as eating or sleeping, and that it is both life-sustaining and inevitable, and that given a chance, we are quite good at it. So with this frame of mind, I'd like us to take a look at how we can potentially start to recognize a lot of hidden learning that goes on in Warhammer. And to do that, I'd like to introduce a tool or share a tool called the Learning Iceberg. And the Learning Iceberg suggests that all the learning we do can be categorized into generally one of three learning contexts. And these learning contexts are formal learning, non-formal learning, and informal learning. I should be clear here and say that these are not meant to be discrete, clear-cut categories. They're actually quite porous and bleed into one another. So this is not about perfect classification. It just gives us almost a set of lenses through which to look at the world. And the reason why this is useful is because if learning can happen anytime, anywhere, any place, even unconsciously, how can we even grab it? How can we make sense of it? The Learning Iceberg gives us a set of goggles to help with that process. So let me briefly introduce each one, and then I'm going to connect them to Warhammer. Formal learning, at the tip of the iceberg, is about intentionally learning something. You're intentionally trying to teach someone something else. It tends to be delivered by an educational organization. There's a hierarchy and curriculum attached to it often, and it usually ends up awarding whoever has learned something a diploma or certificate. So key examples of this: schools, colleges, universities. In fact, when most people think of learning, they actually are thinking of formal learning. Further down the iceberg, we have non-formal learning. Here, learning is again about intentionally trying to teach someone something, but there is no necessarily a structured curriculum. This learning does not necessarily need to be delivered by a training or education organization, and it rarely ends up in you receiving a diploma or certificate. Key examples of this: museums, after-school clubs, any activity like sports clubs, music clubs. Anytime a friend teaches you something, that is non-formal learning. And finally, shrouded beneath the sea, the gargantuan base of the iceberg, informal learning. The majority of our learning is informal, and this is unplanned, unconscious, spontaneous. Learning when we don't even know we are learning. So I would like to now break each of these down and connect them to Warhammer. The first is formal learning, the tip of the iceberg. And I think, but I'm very willing to hear any challenges on this, I do not think there is any formal Warhammer learning, because there is no Warhammer school, Warhammer college, Warhammer university. I cannot think of any Warhammer curriculum in the way there is a maths curriculum or a science curriculum. So I think the tip of the iceberg is empty, barren, and that goes a long way to explain why this myth about not learning anything useful from Warhammer exists. Formal learning is seen as the most useful type of learning. Why? Because you get a diploma out of it, because it helps you get a job. It tends to be seen as learning that is more robust because there are trained teachers that are supposed to instruct you. Additionally, what I find very interesting about formal learning, it is the most visible type of learning. As I've mentioned, most people tend to equate learning to formal learning. However, it is the least frequently occurring type of learning that goes on in our lives. If you take a percentage of how much you learn across your whole lifespan in formal learning compared to the other two types, non-formal and informal, you spend a tiny percentage of your life in formal learning. Of course, this tiny percentage is heavily weighted towards the start of life when you're at school and university. But it is a small percentage, yet it is very visible, partly because, well, schools have dedicated buildings, universities have dedicated buildings, buildings where you go to learn. But when we go to others, when we use other spaces, we don't necessarily tend to think of going them to learn, as we'll see in a moment with non-formal learning. So the tip of the Warhammer iceberg, I think, is barren. Now, if the tip is barren, where is the learning? Where is the Warhammer-related learning? I think it comes in non-formal and informal contexts. So when it comes to non-formal learning, Non-formal, again, is about intentionally teaching someone something, but there is no necessarily a set curriculum. There is no necessarily a diploma at the end of it. And some examples are Warhammer Alliance. So, for example, Warhammer after-school clubs. Anytime you go to a painting workshop, anytime you receive tournament coaching. And the critical one for me is being taught by a friend. And when we use the word teacher here, we need to use teacher not in the sense that we have a trained professional, in a broader sense, which education philosopher Gert Biesta would describe a teacher as someone who helps unlock somebody else's potential. So anyone can be a teacher in this way of thinking, and that is a key strength of non-formal learning. But there are two more things I'd like to add here. Non-formal learning is very good at meeting learners' needs, because when you're teaching a friend, for example, you are tailoring what they are learning about Warhammer to them. If you're teaching them a new gaming system, if you're teaching them 40K when they come from Age of Sigmar, you are tailoring how to teach them the gaming system based on their prior knowledge. Equally, the learner has an interest in what they want to learn, and you can meet in the middle. So it's very tailored to the individual. The other key aspect, which I think is interesting, is non-formal learning tends to be less hierarchical, meaning the distance between master and student or teacher and student is reduced. And this fosters a more egalitarian learning experience, but also I think Warhammer excels at this because there are so many facets to Warhammer that you may be an expert in one, but a novice in another. You can be a wonderful painter, but not a great gamer. You can be an experienced lore buff, but struggle playing a particular gaming system. You might be the #1 Blood Angels ranked player in the world, but you may have no idea how to play Necromunda. So there are always opportunities to interchange the role of teacher and student constantly, to learn from each other in a way that we learn tailoring to each other's needs. So I think non-formal learning is very powerful in this sense. The other aspect where we do a lot of learning is informal. Now, I mentioned informal is mostly unconscious and unplanned. And I use the word mostly because some of the learning we do is unplanned but conscious. And this is what we would call self-directed learning, which is when you learn something because you want to learn it. And you do it by searching for YouTube videos, reading articles, talking to people. An example for me is learning about dice roll probabilities. I just wanted to understand the chances of dice doing certain things to help me choose make in-game strategies, essentially. But in terms of the unconscious, there is some learning which a friend of mine would call sneaky learning, which is quite attached to problem solving, and it's easily understood through an example. About 2 years ago, I decided to take the plunge and buy an airbrush, and I just kept getting clogs no matter what I did. So I spent a couple of hours trying to solve this problem, and I ultimately did. I was excited, and off I continued painting, didn't give it a second thought. It was a couple of weeks later that I realized just how much I had learned sneakily, without realizing, about how to solve this problem. I learned about paint viscosity, about air pressure, but I didn't count it or think about it as learning. I counted it as solving a problem. So this sneaky learning is wonderful and a key part of our Warhammer journeys. But what else does unconscious learning look like? Well, anytime you're dealing with in-game disagreements, you're developing social skills without necessarily realizing. You're taking in body language. You're developing worldviews as to whether people are inherently cheaters or not. You develop ideas from Warhammer, from miniatures, from lore, from talking to other people, from how you game, about what is cool, what is masculine, what is feminine, and you don't necessarily realize them, but again, you're taking them in. And one of my favorites is about language and rule interactions. Anytime we debate rule interactions, we're actually getting a better grasp on language. If we have rules such as this aura affects all allies within 6 inches, am I an ally of myself? Is that what the English language would, when that sentence is written in that particular way, would you expect that to be the intent? So to understand, I think, informal learning, a good analogy is to think about blinking. you blink 15 to 17 times a minute. That is about 900 blinks an hour. It's about 15,000 blinks a day. How aware are you of all these blinks a day, these 15,000? Barely. Maybe something gets in your eye. Doesn't mean you're not doing it. Informal learning is the same, and it shapes who you become. So, taken together, Warhammer-related learning, I would argue, is hiding in plain sight. There's no formal learning, at least I don't think so, but there is an abundance of non-formal and informal learning that, again, is hiding in plain sight, and we just need to put our learning iceberg goggles on to be able to see it. So ultimately, let's return to the question of use. What is this useful for? What is Warhammer-related useful for? Well, very simply, I would say it is useful to enjoy life and flourish as a human being. And I return to Etienne Wenger's quote, where learning is self-sustaining. Learning is about what humans do. We are naturally curious creatures. Learning is a reward in and of itself. Learning is a celebration of being human. That's why when toddlers learn to stack cubes for the first time, they're ecstatic. Is it because they're about to get a job or a higher paycheck? No, it's just because they learned something. So learning is a celebration of being human. Learning whilst you're doing an activity you enjoy, like Warhammer, directly feeds your soul. Therefore, returning to our original myth, doing Warhammer is a waste of time because you won't learn anything useful from it. I'll channel my inner Mythbuster and say, myth busted. And with that, I'll conclude and I'll leave my email there. If you're, I'm also the editor of, as Mike mentioned at the start, of the Zeitgeist of Pop Culture. It's a free book, open access, and explores essays looking at different aspects of Warhammer. I left the QR code there if you're interested. And if not, I'll finish there. Say thank you very much for listening.